Thank you, Shanaka. And I think Jane and Sadun set the stage very well going into the first panel discussion. So good morning, everyone, first of all. Welcome to the first panel discussion of AmCham Sri Lanka CEO Forum, a new chapter for Sri Lanka, restoring economic confidence through reforms, resilience, and international engagement. Sri Lanka stands at a critical inflection point. The country has gone through many challenges. It has gone through the Easter Sunday bombings, the COVID pandemic, the financial crisis, and recently, Cyclone Ditwa. Yet, alongside these challenges, we are also seeing meaningful reforms, renewed policy discipline, and engagement with international partners. Today's discussion is what comes next. How Sri Lanka can rebuild investor confidence, strengthen macroeconomic stability, and position itself as a credible, competitive destination for global businesses. We are fortunate today to have three distinguished panelists who are directly shaping and observing this journey from a policy, diplomatic, and development finance perspective. Welcome, gentlemen. In terms of questions coming in, there you will see a QR code shortly. You could scan and send your questions over. We have about 45 minutes for the entire panel, and I will basically ask questions which you can select the particular panelist in the app itself and send the questions across. Let me start off with a few questions. Governor, if I may start with you. First of all, Governor, thank you for being here with us today, despite your busy schedule. Governor, first question in terms of reforms and stability. Macroeconomic stabilization has been a top priority. From your perspective, which reforms have had the most impact on in restoring confidence, and what reforms are still critical to ensure long-term stability?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me for this important forum. When we look at the stability, obviously, after the crisis, we learn a very hard way the importance of macro stability that we have been able to achieve through several reforms, especially from our point of view, central bank point of view. Most critical landmark reform was the new Central Bank Act, which gave the central bank independence with strong accountability to the public, parliament, and also to the markets. As a result, we have been able to achieve what we call monetary stability. And also, next reform was the amendment of the Banking Act, which strengthened central bank second objective, which is financial system stability, for our strengthening regulatory and supervisory framework to ensure a stronger, stable financial system, especially when you look at deposit-taking institutions that comes under our regulations. So those are the two most important reforms when you look at the mainly the overall macro stability. Obviously, other part of the reform, I'm sure when ST is here, we'll talk about on the fiscal side, the stability on the fiscal discipline and fiscal policy, and also fiscal rules through Public Finance Management Act, that is a landmark legislation that was introduced out of the crisis. As a result of those, and in addition, I can especially touch on the addressing governance issues in terms of IMF diagnosis study on vulnerabilities on corruption and governance issues. That's a part of the reform. If you ask me to what is to be completed, I think that's in the process of implementing recommendations of that report, the diagnosis report, which was published first in Asia, and government is in the process of implementing. That's the next important reform, especially after achieving macroeconomic stability. Next part is the governance and addressing corruption. I think government has strong commitment to implement that part. From our point of view, from central bank point of view, what we see right now here, after very high inflation we experienced in 70%, now long period of low and stable inflation has have anchored inflation expectations around our target of 5%. Now, very clearly, our inflation expectations survey clearly indicate inflation expectations have been very well anchored. This is a very important one for any economy to perform in the medium to long term basis. Inflation expectations anchored around the target is critical. So that is an important variable that will determine for any business investment, where to invest, how to invest, what are the margins, how negotiate wage contracts. All are low and stable inflation is very critical. That's what we, on this new Central Bank Act, with this reform, we will ensure the low and stable inflation will remain, and also at the, connected to that as well, other part is external sector stability. When you look at the anchoring inflation expect can also help stabilizing exchange rate variation. And also other part, stability part of that is to building official external reserves to much more comfortable level. That is what we have been able to build up so far this year, and we'll continue to build that. I think I'm very confident that this year, for 6.8 billion reserves we had last year, we certainly exceed 8 billion by end of this year, which is going to be one of the highest we had in the recent past, but we'll continue to build. That is the other part of the stability under Central Banking Act. We will, and also while maintaining relatively less volatility in the exchange rate and determined by the market, depending on market forces. That is the key. We need to continue. And on the stability point of view, we need to continue in the same direction. Now, I'm sure fiscal side also that will continue, ST will give the commitment. There's strong commitment by the government to stay in the path, on the path that has been implemented several years. That is, I think, obviously there are a lot of other reforms. For now we see growth is pretty stable around 5%. But for us to move into high growth path, obviously there are a lot of other structural reforms need to happen. I'm sure the World Bank and others can talk about this necessary structural reforms. Those are the reforms that needs to be continued to implement. With that, our capacity to grow should go beyond 5%. We think potential growth right now is 4.5 to 5%. We need to expand the capacity to grow by implementing all the reforms. That, I think, the continuous agenda on the reforms will need to go ahead. I'll stop here and I can answer your question.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Governor. So essentially, like a targeted inflation policy, strengthening the Banking Act, and also central banking independence is what we have seen. And like you very correctly said, the theme of this particular session is also to see how we can propel Sri Lanka for growth through that mid-digit of 4 to 5% as well. So with that, Zach, could I come to you next? In terms of international confidence, from the US government perspective, what progress has Sri Lanka made in regaining international economic confidence?
Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Dilshan. Thanks for having me here today. I think it's a great question. Just kind of piggybacking on what the governor said, I think there's been remarkable transformation in the last few years. He mentioned 70% inflation. You had queues for petrol and a lack of foreign currency. And so there has been a remarkable transformation since the financial crisis. And I think U.S. investors have noticed this, U.S. businesses noticed this. There's a lot more confidence when we talk to U.S. companies that are operating in this market. They're a lot happier today than they were a few years ago. They're a lot happier today than they were a year ago. And I think there's a cautious optimism is what I hear often. I was just having a conversation earlier this morning. So from the U.S. perspective, I think there are a lot of opportunities. But as the central bank governor mentioned, there is a lot of work to be done still. So we look forward to working with Sri Lanka to kind of help in the reform process going forward.
Thanks, Zach. If I can come to you next, Gregory. In terms of, from a World Bank's perspective and the lens, how does Sri Lanka recovery compare with other economies that have gone through similar crises?
There's a lot of good things to say. About 4 years ago, the economy was on its knees, and has been mentioned, people queuing around the block for basics, like to put fuel in their car, to get gas to cook. The economy was in a terrible place. Part of this was due to bad luck and repeat shocks, and part of this was down to bad policy. So it's quite amazing where we are 4 years on, where we've seen consistently good policies bring the economy back from the depths of crisis, back towards growth of 4-5% in a benign macro environment where businesses can plan without excessive volatility. And I think this has been achieved through a change in policies, all the things the governor said I agree with. There's also been an element of good luck. In 2022, oil prices soared over 100%. Today, they're around $65, $66, which has been fortuitous, because this economy is still very reliant on importing coal and oil. On the other side of the external account, you've seen real success in increased tourist numbers coming in, bringing the dollars in, and also remittances have been incredible in the last couple of years. All of this has led to some pretty historic macro numbers where the external part of the economy, the current account, has been in surplus, and the fiscal policy has also been in surplus, which under the IMF program has really led to this stabilization and solid platform for growth. And so, you know, when I analyze many other economies coming out of debt, sovereign debt default, coming out of such a deep crisis, this economy is doing well to not only maintain those solid policies, but also see growth bounce back, credit provided by the banking sector. That said, we've done the easy bit to some extent. What's next needed is consistency, because the country, there are sort of different types of country 10 years on from a crisis. There are what we call serial defaulters like Argentina or Ecuador that default on their debt and end up in the same problem 5 years later. There are countries that muddle through a bit, they do the tough policies, but then there's an election, then there's a shock, and the fiscal policy goes back to suggesting maybe we should subsidize the fuel again. Maybe we should provide some fiscal stimulus. And then there are economies that really move on and do these structural reforms. And you point to the East Asian countries after the late 90s that said no more. We can't go through currency shocks like this. We can't do this. We need to get our buffers in order and ensure that we're resilient. Whatever the world throws at us over the next couple of decades, we're going to stand on 2 feet. India, to the same extent, in the early 90s did that and have grown on a really solid macroeconomic platform. So there's a decision to make, certainly in the coming years when things get tough, whether, you know, beyond the IMF program, there's a need to keep this stability and keep going with the structural reforms, because it takes a lot of energy. And one of the phrases used is reform fatigue. And I think Sri Lanka really needs to work hard to continue this excellent progress is making, so that when the next global shocks come in the years ahead, that the country isn't vulnerable and has sufficient buffers. And I think 3 things: it's maintaining the fiscal and monetary policy in the manner in which it's been conducted. And for me, it's renewable electricity to reduce the vulnerability to swings in global energy prices. And then 3, making the economy more competitive. So it's exporting goods and providing jobs here in Sri Lanka.
Thanks, Gregory. So the twin surpluses are certainly positive on the fiscal side and the current account side. I think, like you mentioned, staying in terms of policy consistency and making sure you continue on that path is going to be critical. Governor, if I could come back to you in terms of the next question. Inflationary and currency stability are top concerns for businesses. How is the central bank thinking about maintaining price and financial stability with the economy returning to growth?
Yeah, thank you. This is again an important question. For example, it's about multiple stance that we see now. When you look at our inflation target, it's around 5% or somewhere around or below 5%. A medium to long-term basis, that's as I say, stable inflation on forward-looking basis. So we have multiple stance is certainly is on the basis that looking at the forward-looking inflation and also the output gap, what we call the potential versus the where we actually growing. So what we see right now in terms of the growth, in terms of supply of credit to the economy, that has been in line with our monetary policy stance of current 7.75% policy rate, which is in real terms, real interest rate is about 2.75. I think any economy that can maintain real policy rate around 2 to 3% compared to the inflation, future forward-looking inflation, we have sufficient space for us to be able to use, as I call it, as monetary policy space, a monetary policy buffer. If we need to use, for example, if economy is going to grow below the potential, we see that's going to be, as already we mentioned, we never know when there will be another shock in terms of internal kind of a climate event or external geopolitics or any kind of a trade sanction. We never know. Only thing we can prepare is that creating, as already mentioned, buffers. Monetary policy side, we have created sufficient buffers in terms of policy space. There are a lot of flexibility there. So if economy is going to go below the potential, then we have sufficient space as to reduce interest rates and push that economy getting back to the potential. If we think again other side also, if we think economy is growing too fast and going to create unnecessary kind of a excess, the demand creating through excessive credit growth or excessive growth in imports, then we have tools to deal with that. In terms of one is the interest rate tool, we have space here, and second one is to let the exchange rate to adjust, so that adjust the demand for itself side, both imports and exports. So that's a good part of the flexible inflation targeting regime, where we have both instruments to deal with. They let the exchange rate to adjust, absorb any shock that is coming from external side, and interest rates to be used as a larger domestic aggregate demand, so that we have levers to pull from the monetary policy side. On the financial stability side, we see now the banking sector compared to where they were back in 2022, 2023, with the concerns on the external debt restructuring, domestic restructuring, and issues with the liquidity, the capital, and asset quality. Now today, our banking sector has a lot of buffers already built in. There's capital, liquidity, and also improving the stage 3 loan ratios, rapidly coming down. As a result, and also with stronger framework for banking sector supervision, we have sufficient space, and bankers have built their buffers to be able to absorb any kind of shock that's going forward. That's where I think we prepare for this future. This is obviously from our side, for financial sector buffers and also monetary sector buffers, and also resource. We need to continue to build resource as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. That's very clear. Some of the questions coming in is more on the fiscal side, where Governor will essentially cover more on the monetary policy side. So as and when the questions are being asked, I shall post to you, panel. If I can come next to you again, Zach. In terms of US-Sri Lanka economic ties, where do you see the greatest potential for deepening US-Sri Lanka commercial and investment ties in the next few years?
Thanks, Dilshan. First off, I'll say I think we have a very strong economic relationship. Judging by everyone in this room, there's many US companies operating in this market, but we can go deeper, we can go better. We would like to see more US companies operating here, but that's going to take some of the things that we've already talked about today, regulatory consistency, reform efforts. These businesses have a choice. They're looking at markets around the world. So Sri Lanka really needs to set itself apart to attract US companies, which are, I am biased, but the best companies in the world. I think that is one angle. We would also really like to see more US exports coming to Sri Lanka. We have run historical trade deficits with Sri Lanka. We produce very high quality products in America, ranging from agricultural commodities, machinery, pharmaceuticals, could go on and on. We think there's a lot of potential in this market and that people are interested in these products. So again, we would like to see efforts to improve market access so people can enjoy these products and our commercial relationship can strengthen. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Gregory, if I can come back to you again. In terms of the growth model, what structural changes are necessary for Sri Lanka to move from stabilization to sustained inclusive growth?
I believe the growth we have at the moment is sustainable and inclusive. It will create jobs and bring in many parts of the country. That said, there's an effort to, sort of from a geographic perspective, to invest in the north and east of the country, which this government seems committed to, which is a great sign, and also rebuild from the devastating impacts of the cyclone. And when it comes to sort of headline growth numbers, when we look at the 5 years through the Easter bombings, through COVID, through the crisis, the economy basically grows on average at a slightly negative number. And that's what I call mess it up growth, because we've got big policy errors compounded by shocks. And then when the economy gets a bit of luck, there aren't too many shocks and the policies are better. Growth has bounced back from 3 now to a sort of a range of 4-5%. And I think this can be maintained simply with that stability. I think anything higher than that, moving towards the aspiration for 7% growth, which is where the economy doubles in a decade, and many economies in Asia, in South Asia even, have achieved this growth rate, and it's doable. But what I call this is creative growth, because you've got to create something that other people want to buy. You've got to be competitive. You've got to invest in the tourist infrastructure so we go from 2 to 3 million. You've got to invest in agribusiness so that Sri Lankan goods are being exported to the Gulf on numerous flights per day. You've got to ensure that young, bright people can form IT companies here and deliver services all over the world. And I think that's the hard part. And I think there's a lot of good ideas at the moment, but it just takes a lot of effort and build. So I think we get, simply with stability, we get 4% growth. But that next set of numbers higher than that requires this creativity. And that's really tricky. It's not impossible, but it's really tricky. And going back to one of the points, there are some basics that could be achieved. So if we talk about the north and east, just getting there quicker through better transport. If we talk about running a business, just buy cheaper electricity. It's extremely expensive here. So if you manage to get renewable electricity fast-tracked and the reforms in the energy sector, then we'd see businesses thrive from that pricing and the additional benefit of having that external buffer for when the shocks come in the future. And one of the things I think that's been excellent that I've seen over the last couple of years is support to small and medium-term size enterprises. Small firms being receiving support, receiving training, receiving access to credit. And that's something we've been working a lot with IFC through our investments and our advisory work. And it's great to see those companies thriving.
Thanks, Gregory. And if I could have a follow-up questions on the same line in terms of you especially mentioned about the SMEs and the small firms. So in terms of social and economic balance perspective, reforms at times comes with some level of social cost. How can Sri Lanka balance fiscal reforms while protecting vulnerable communities and still remain attractive to investors?
I think, any population can always benefit from a bit more government expenditure. But when we talk about social cost to me is inflation over 50%. It was devastating in 2022. That's social cost. An economic crisis brought the country to its knees. People moved back into poverty. Some people struggled to afford enough food. So when we talk about social cost, avoiding crisis is social benefit. So I think we need the fiscal policies that maintain the stability. And then I think the benefits for people come through stability, through forums like this, CEOs making greater investments, getting ideas, innovation, and expanding. And I think it's through jobs that social benefits really improve over the years. And I think that there will be pressure on the fiscal, but inflation at 50% and plus, there's nothing more damaging than that.
Understood. That's very clear, Gregory. Thank you. There is a similar question as well, Zach. So the next question which we have is, what type of reforms or policy consistency do international partners like the US look for when encouraging private investments into the country?
So I'll start off and say that our embassy publishes an annual investor climate statement that talks about these all at length. I won't bore you and go into all of that, but that's everything that US investors, US companies are looking for in terms of consistency on the regulatory side, taxes, customs, how to register a business, all the kind of nuts and bolts of operating in a market. That's what they're looking for, and I forget which panel member mentioned it, but they want to be able to plan 1 year out, 5 years out, 10 years out. They're making significant investments, so they need to know that the money that they're putting in here is going to be safe, and that they're going to get a return on their investment, and that they're not going to have too many hassles along the way in dealing with it. There's other issues, labor, some of the electricity and power issues that Greg mentioned as well. Also kind of the macro relationship, fiscal space, and monetary, how the country is doing overall. So yeah, these are all areas that U.S. investors are looking at when they are making kind of crucial decisions of, am I going to operate in this market or not?
Thanks, Zach. If I can stay with you, there's one question coming in. This person would like to know what specific areas that the US will focus on in the Sri Lankan economy, and what would require more focus and attention. I think the question is more to do in terms of sectors, what areas or focus sectors would probably be.
Right, so we're open to working on all sectors. I think, Jane mentioned earlier the port. We see that as a very important part of this country, a very important part of the economy. There was a group of U.S. businesses and investors here in the last couple of weeks. They met with terminal operators, they met with SLPA, other folks in the government to kind of talk about the advantages that their products could bring to such an important key asset in Sri Lanka. I also want to kind of talk about the other way around. Again, as Jane mentioned, we think there's great opportunity for Sri Lankan companies to invest in the United States, and again, kind of deepen that two-way trade relationship. So we are open to discussing anyone who's interested in that, and we have a colleague who's going to be on a panel later today from our Department of Commerce, Kerry Arun, whose focus area that is. So we can talk about more of that then. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Very clear. So essentially, it's obviously two-way trade, and the US is open for any sector in that sense. And I guess Sri Lanka's priority sectors are the logistics, the IT, the pharma, to name a few, and obviously the trade piece. Governor, if I can come back to you, and there's been a few questions on the same lines. Many CEOs here represent companies making long-term investment decisions. What signals or indicators should investors watch that demonstrate that Sri Lanka is firmly on a path for sustainable recovery?
I think looking forward to have confidence in investment, one thing I would closely monitor would be sovereign rating. How independent rating agencies rates Sri Lankan sovereign. Because we saw with the crisis, we went into a default category, and with the completion of debt restructuring almost fully completed, we are now back in the CCC. I think with the completion of small restructuring in Sri Lankan Airlines, I'm sure ST can respond to that. It will be completed soon. With that, what I expect, first signal, what I would like to see is the improvement in sovereign ratings. From one notch, we get back to a B category where we were before the crisis. That's one important move in terms of having independent assurance of our medium to long-term outlook for the economy. Secondly, what we need to monitor, follow, is a continuation of these policies, especially with the program with the IMF and other programs with the World Bank and ADB in terms of policy reforms. So if we need to ensure, and anyone who wants the stability would like to see the continuation of those programs in the same direction as Nandalal also mentioned, with the IMF program or without IMF program, with the World Bank or with the ADB, any kind of reforms linked programs, we need to ensure that we are moving in the right direction, because those are reforms that we need to implement. Those should be owned by us, and we should take the leadership to implement all this without any external kind of a commitment or with that. Good to have some commitment because that will give us some final decision, but even without that, we need to move in the right direction. That is what, as already mentioned by our World Bank gentlemen, with some other countries, India or East Asian countries, follow. This is where we need to look forward to. And other one is that the overall fiscal is always, historically, if you look at why Sri Lanka has been going to IMF for bailing out several times, 16, 17 times, is because of the fiscal indiscipline from time to time, especially close to elections, and there are signs of moving away from the prudential policies, which is very important. So that's where business community and public at large need to basically demand from the authorities to maintain good, stable policies in the same direction, irrespective of any election cycles or any short-term gains, and ensure maintain the medium to long-term stable, predictable policies. That's, I think, something that I'm sure a strong commitment that we have seen. I hope that will continue.
It does, Governor. Thank you very much. I see ST here, and especially on the fiscal side, there are quite a few questions. And I'll let ST address it during the speech. The questions, ST, is mainly in terms of making sure, how do we manage and reduce the production costs and strengthen competitiveness in terms of Sri Lankan exports? And is the current tax structure, is it growth supportive? And how do you sustain it? Governor, there's a question on bank consolidation, if I can and pose that to you. Governor, what is the plan for bank consolidation, and how many banks, commercial banks, I presume, do you think Sri Lanka should have?
I think it's difficult for me to say this is the exact number of banks we need to have. But when you look at the banking structure here, we have three parts. One is the state-owned banks, three large and some small ones. Then private sector banks, big and small, and then branches of foreign banks. We don't have a established branch foreign banks, branches of these banks. When you look at the structure, I think first priority what we see is to easier one in terms of consolidation is, I think SU also here is government is supportive of consolidating some of the small state banks with the bigger state banks, strengthen the state bank, large state bank. That's important, and make it those banks to be able to compete with the bigger banking business, the private and foreign banks. For that, these banks need to strengthen. Small banks need to be merged with the. Obviously, there are some small banks can remain because those are serving into different communities. For inclusive purposes, they are basically business models are to support the MSMEs, MS. Those will be there, will have to be there. But other small banks should be, should be merged with large. That's a state bank's part, and then strengthen the state bank structure. Already there's a very good banking reforms going on. On the private sector banks, so we see different size of banks with different business models. Again, we have very clearly articulated in our this year annual policy agenda. Yeah, we would like to see a stronger, bigger private banks, local private banks. That's where we have set certain targets, and within next couple of years, if banks are not moving and strengthening their balance sheets and ratios to a certain level, there's obviously there will be no choice. We'll be encouraging and basically making them to merge and make a stronger private sector banks. When it comes to foreign banks, obviously, I can see large number of foreign banks. Those some are very small, not very active. We would like to encourage them to be deploy their capital rich, but they are very small, operating in a very small market, small niche areas. Like to see them be much more active and deploy their capital in much more broad ways. So obviously, there are some foreign banks are moving away from the retail banking. Now you see two large banks. They are based on this model. But I think the reason is that some banks cannot compete with the private banks in the retail area. That's a natural transition. I don't mind that. But still, presence of foreign banks, we'd like to see a much more active participation in whichever area their strength and advantages, depending on their headquarters and their operations, big operations with the global markets, and connecting with those markets is important. So I think the foreign banks can play here.
And Governor, you mentioned also initially that the buffers have been now built up as well, despite the credit growth that is adequate to absorb the shocks, if at all, if it comes in. Governor, if I can stay with you, Governor mentioned that we have headrooms to reduce. Governor mentioned that we have headroom to reduce interest rates given an environment that we will have to stimulate the economy. In this situation, will we be able to still maintain 5% inflation target?
I think what we see, economy will reach, and this is based on the understanding of the government what is the appropriate inflation target for Sri Lanka. In 2023, with the New Sri Lanka Bank Act, we did some research and agreed with the government that for country like Sri Lanka, appropriate target would be 5%. Obviously, after the structural change and very high inflation, it came a little below. So last 2 years it has been below around 3%, now around 2%. But our research showed that country like Sri Lanka need to have 5% like this target. So what we see, obviously, in the inflation targeting framework, is not good for us to revise quite frequently. So there's a revision coming up next 3 years. We are now working and looking at, again, empirical evidence and compare with other countries what is and also domestic structural change that has happened, we have seen here, but to be the appropriate inflation target. So we are working on, and with the Minister of Finance, we come to an agreement and see whether we need a review or whether we maintain same thing. That's still, I think, too early for us to have that agreement because it goes until, I think, September this year. So by the time we sign the agreement again for another 3 years, or we can maintain this. But I think we will critically review whether this target is appropriate. Given the experience that we have to understand why inflation was moving below the target for last couple of years, is basically volatility in other kind of electricity and electricity price changes. Once those are stable, we will have clear picture on medium long-term basis what's appropriate target. So that we are working on that. I'm sure we'll come up with the most appropriate target for. I don't think that has to be very much different from what we see now. There could be changes also.
Governor, if I can stay with you 3 times in a row, there's a lot of interest on PayPal, so I thought I'll answer the question. When will Sri Lanka businesses be granted full access to PayPal merchant services?
PayPal is a business-to-business connection. This is not, we don't regulate, we don't block, or we have no restriction for these companies to come and do business here. This is a business relation with the PayPal or any other similar company with our local banks. Understand there has been discussion going on that we have been also informed. So we think those will go ahead and successfully and the company or whatever company will agree to have established business here. But we saw in the past, they have not seen Sri Lanka as a viable, feasible business destination, given their size of operation globally. We have seen the positive movements that they are engaging with some of the banks here, and I hope that there will be a positive outcome soon. It's not with us, it's with the banking sector.
Absolutely, Governor. And it's a business to business, so it does not need to be regulated per se. So with that, we come close to the first panel discussion. Let me thank our panelists for their insightful thoughts and sharing very frankly, and all of you for your engagement. Sri Lanka stands at a pivotal moment. Through reforms, resilience, and international engagement, we can open up new chapter of growth and confidence for Sri Lanka. Let's carry this message forward, and let's all envision to be the change that we want to be. With that, thank you, panel, and thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dilshan Perera, for steering